Hello, night dwellers. I hope everyone had a wonderful Tuesday. Let's see. Hello. Hello, hello, hello. How is everyone doing? They all know they. Let's try. Come on in, make yourselves at home. Hello. Hello, Amy. Hello, Zena. Welcome. If you are brand new here and this is your first time in Twisted Tales Live, let me know. I want to welcome you. Thank you for the FYP. Welcome in. Hello, Charlene. Hey, James. Hey, Kingfisher. Hello, Julie. Hello, Melissa Moss. How are you? Hey, Palm. Welcome in. Oh, thank you, Kingfisher. Thank you. Good to see some new names. Hello, Jessica. Hey, Kimmy. Hey, Amy. Hey, Angel 007. Hey, Boss Man. Tonight, True Crime Night. Hey Judy. Hello. How are all my lovelies doing? My lords and ladies. My friends. Hey Pamela. How are you? Hey Vampire Rose. Hello Beach Nut. I love the beach too. Hey Rhonda. Hello Ray Sisters. How are you? To all the new ones joining. Do you like scary stories? Hello Linda Gillum. Let's start sharing the live. Tonight is a story that needs to be heard. And I'm warning you, you're gonna want a box of tissues. The Night Queen has hers. Should I or shouldn't I? Let's see. I want you to see more of the castle, of course. Is this good? Can you see everything? Hey, Ray Bad. Hello, Tonya. Hello, lovely. Good. Hey, Mia. Hello, Callie Rose. Trying to get it right. It's a daily thing. Hello, Danis. Aw, thank you. Hello, Just. Make sure that we are sharing this live. This is a story. I am just so emotional right now, just even thinking about it. So. Hello, hello, hello. Share this with friends, family, co-workers, neighbors, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, platforms, whatever you can do. Let's get this out there, please. Also, tap to the music. Who was it that recommended that last night? It was great. Tap, 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 tap. Hello, Dana. How are you? I am good. Let's bring it down to a solemn tone. I've got to find something that is fitting. Ooh. Do I like this or do I not? Let's see. Hello, Dan. Hey, Jim Rocks. Hello, Martha. Hey, Court Jesus Kid. As you are coming in, make yourselves at home. Hello, Tammy Weber. Hello, Mia. I think I've said it hi 3 times to you, Mia. I say it again. Hello, Mia. Oh my goodness. Hey, Tara. How are you, darling? Hello, Karen Coleman. You will want tissues. I am warning you. Hey, Firefly. That name always puts a smile on my face. Hello, Callie. Thank you for sharing the live. No, I don't like that. Nope, I don't like that either. I guess we'll go with this one. Can you hear the music? Let me know. Hello, YouTube. I am not. Hey, Melinda. How are you? Hey, Rose. Thank you all for being here. Hello, Turtle Woman. Did you know that my favorite stuffed animal is a turtle? Hello, Melanie. I hope you're feeling better tonight, my darling. Over in YouTube land. Hello, Kimmy. Hello, Mary. Hey, legend of the 80s. You have your tissues handy. I hope so. minute. Everyone come in, make yourselves at home. Thank you for the gift, Just. Northern Mom, hello and welcome. Ohio Girl, hello and welcome. Hello, Harper's Happenings. Thank you, Callie. Hello, Sherry. How are you? Tonight is a true crime case such as you have never heard. When it was presented to me, I had heard of it, bits and pieces of it, but I had never truly heard the whole story. And when I read it and was doing my research, I was absolutely appalled. Tonight is a serious true crime night. Prepare yourselves for this story. But first, let's begin. Lower your lights. Light a candle for ambiance. Lock your doors. Pull your curtains nice and tight. Wrap yourself in your warmest blanket to avoid the chills that are about to crawl up your spine. And let's begin. This is the Night Realm. I am the Night Queen. You are my night dwellers. Come with me into the Night Realm and let the stories begin. I'm going to show you a picture. And when you see it, This is George Stinney Jr. And this is the case that I will be bringing to you tonight. How old does he look in that picture? Quite young, right? Now let me expand the picture. And then look at his face again. Hello, Alabama. This story is about a boy, George Stinney Jr., a boy that was born in the wrong time. Before his name became synonymous with one of the most shameful miscarriages of justice in American history, George Junius Stinney Jr. was simply a boy, a son, a brother, and a dreamer in the small, segregated mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina. Born on October the 21st, 1929, George Jr. was the second of 5 children born to George Sr. His father was a sawmill worker employed by the Alcolu Lumber Company, and Amy Stinney, a woman named in the community for her quiet strength, was his mother. The Stinney family lived in a modest company house set on the black side of town, a line drawn not by fences, but by racial codes and unspoken laws that governed every breath of life in Jim Crow, South Carolina. Alcolu was a world carved down the center. The white children attended one school. The black children attended another. White workers had their own company store and clinic. Black workers had to fend for themselves. The Stinneys grew vegetables in their yard and raised chickens, not just out of necessity, but because options were limited back then for black families. George Jr. was known to be smart, curious, and obedient. He loved riding his bicycle and reading the Bible. This boy had dreams. Though at 14, that's correct, I said 14 years old, they were fragile ones. often pushed aside by the reality of his surroundings. Though soft-spoken and polite, George was aware, perhaps too early, that the world around him could be dangerous, very dangerous indeed. That if he smiled at a white woman too long, or said the wrong thing to a man who looked like he'd seen war, it could cost him more than just a scolding. In Alkulu, being black meant that you knew how to disappear, how to keep your head down, and how to survive without being seen. George Jr. was small for his age. I want you to listen very carefully to this. He was 5'1" and barely 95 pounds soaking wet. That would become a haunting irony in the months to come. George Jr. had never been in trouble, not once. His teachers described him as respectful. His siblings said that he was protective and kind. But none of that would matter on the day that he became a target. Because on the other side of town, two little girls were about to take a ride they would never return from. Now let me tell you about the two girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, the lost blossoms of Alkulu. Betty June Binnicker was 11 years old, with strawberry blonde curls and a mischievous streak a mile wide. She lived in the white part of Alkulu with her parents and younger siblings. Her father was a foreman, and the Binnicker family was known in the community, church-going, respected, traditional. Betty June was outgoing. She had never met a stranger, with a habit of asking a lot of questions and a love of picking wildflowers. Her best friend was Mary Emma Thames, a quiet 7-year-old who lived just a few houses away. Mary Emma was more reserved than Betty. She was sweet-natured, but she was a bit shy. She followed Betty June wherever she went. The two girls were inseparable and had spent that spring day on March the 23rd, 1944, just like any other, riding their bikes on the dirt roads that ran along the railroad tracks, talking about everything and nothing. The stage is set. I described George Stinney Jr. to you. I described Betty Lou. And I described the youngest 7-year-old, Mary Emma. Now, let's begin the story. Chapter 1, the town where the sky held secrets. Sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest injustices. In the pine-thick stillness of Alculu, South Carolina, time moves slowly, like a turtle, like steam rising off red clay in the summer heat. But beneath this sleepy southern charm, a storm was waiting. It wore the face of a 14-year-old black boy. And one spring morning in 1944, that storm broke. It was the kind of town that disappeared behind the trees. If you're from this portion of the country, you know what I mean. It had no stoplights. I don't believe that Alculu does to this day. Just gravel roads and train tracks that split the land like a scar. On one side of the tracks were the white families, mill workers, churchgoers, proud of their community and their order. On the other side of the tracks, you had the black families that lived in small houses with sagging porches and dusty yards. Their lives ruled by unwritten laws and the hot southern sun. The lumber mill owned everything. The homes, the stores, even the smiles. And everyone in Alculu knew their place. George Stinney was just 14. He was a boy with wide eyes and sharp cheeks. He was small for his age. Everyone talked about little George. 5'1", I'll remind you. Barely 90 pounds soaking wet. He liked to run through the fields with his little sister, Amy, and he had a dog that followed him everywhere. His family was poor, but they were proud. His father worked at the mill. He worked hard for his 5 children and his wife. His mother cooked and cleaned and raised her children in a world where black children were seen but never heard, not unless they were crying. This was something that she instilled in her children at a very young age. Just terrible. When you walk through the town, don't look at anyone. Don't talk to anyone. Promise me you'll be like that. Okay, kids? Yes, Mom. George was bright. He was observant. He knew how to move quietly in a world that was always watching. But he couldn't have known on March the 23rd, 1944, 2 white girls bicycling down the dirt road near his home would change everything. Betty June Binnicker, as I said earlier, was 11. Mary Emmett Thames was 7. They both were blonde, smiling, and full of life. They were last seen riding their bikes in the black section of town, looking for flowers. They stopped and spoke to George and Amy. Do you know where the maypops are? We're wanting to make a bouquet for Mama. It was the fruit of the passion flower vine. That's all they said. That's all George ever admitted to. I saw them. They were picking flowers. It was a moment a conversation, and then they rode away. And the two girls never came back. By evening, Aukulu was unsettled. The girls hadn't returned home. A search party was formed, combing through woods and ditches. Bloodhounds, hound dogs were sniffing, barking. Lanterns lighting up the woods and the fields beyond. And then, just before nightfall, George told his parents something strange. "I just don't know what has happened to those two girls," George's mama said. And George looked at them across the supper table. "I saw those girls today, Mama. I saw them. What were they doing? They were just on their bikes and they were picking wildflowers." Amy, his mother, looked at George Sr. One eyebrow was raised. You know that mother's intuition. "Did you say anything to them?" "I just told them where they could pick flowers." It was an innocent comment, but it would be the last time that George spoke freely. The next morning, March the 24th, the girls were found in a shallow ditch. Their skulls had been crushed. Betty June's bicycle lay twisted beside them. Blood stained the earth like a warning. They had been brutally attacked, left like broken dolls beneath the trees. Word spread like fire in a small town like Akulu. Not just through Akulu, but through every room divided by a skin. Amy pulled back the curtain that separated George from his sisters, and she looked at him. The town wanted a name, demanded it. They wanted a reason. They wanted a monster. They didn't need to search long. They already had a suspect. The next day, it was bright, sunny. You could feel the humidity in the South Carolina air. George was sitting on the porch when he saw the police cars. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just took him. Two white deputies. No warrant. No explanation. George's parents were not allowed to follow. "Where are you taking my boy?" George Sr. asked. And Amy, his mother, "What has he done?" "We'll be right with you, George. We're coming right behind you." "No, you're not, ma'am. You stay right where you are," the sheriff warned. His little sister, Amy, who was with him the day before, just feet away, never saw her brother again until it was too late. They forced George into the back of the deputy's car. They did not speak to him the whole way. George was a 14-year-old boy. They put cuffs on him. They threw George into a back room at the local jail. Can you imagine? A 14-year-old boy. Never been in trouble with the law before. Alone. No lawyer present. No parent. And then the door opened. And the two men that had arrested him walked in. They pulled out a chair. You did it, didn't you? You did it. George looked at them wide-eyed. No, sir. You did it. You did it to those two girls. They were demanding answers that he didn't have. When did you do it? What time was it? Hours later, the two men emerged. They looked at everyone gathered in the lobby. He confessed. He did it. But there was no written statement, no audio recording, no signature, just their words. He confessed. He did it. Word spread. They said George Stinney Jr., unalived, Betty and Mary Emma, with a 15-inch railroad spike, dragged their bodies to a ditch and left them to perish, all without anyone seeing him, all in the span of moments. It was impossible. But impossible didn't matter back then. They had what they wanted. They had a black boy, and they had a confession. That's all they needed. They moved this 14-year-old boy 50 miles away to avoid a lynch mob. People said if they could get their hands around him, he would be unalived. Even in the jail cell, he was a child among men, tiny, terrified, and trembling, 5'1". Some say that he cried every night. Some said that he asked the guards, screaming and crying, "Why am I here? I didn't do anything. I want my mom." He was alone in a cold cell, eating off metal trays, shivering against concrete walls. Outside, the town grieved for the two girls, but no one grieved for George. No one came to help. No one could. His parents sat outside the jail and begged and screamed when they heard that their son had been accused of unaliving the two girls. Back in Al-Kulu, George's family fled. Threats came daily, bricks thrown through the windows, crosses set on fire. Men stood on porches with weapons. White neighbors whispered with rage in their eyes. George's father lost his job. The few jobs that Amy had, washing clothes, they were told, you either leave or you're going to end up somewhere you don't want to be. So they left their town, their home. They had no choice. And so in the span of 24 hours, a child was taken, interrogated without counsel of any kind, and declared guilty in the eyes of the Alkulu community. George's life became a countdown, a child in a cage, a death row inmate before puberty, and no one, not a soul in power, spoke up for this boy. Akalu was still. The flowers didn't grow that spring. The sky didn't weep. But somewhere behind prison bars, a child, please keep that in mind, a child sat in a dark cell in silence. And the clock began to tick. Chapter 2, the trial that lasted one day. Justice should never be this fast or this silent. The law is supposed to protect the innocent. But in 1944, South Carolina, it moved with alarming speed when the accused was black and the victims were white. For George Stinney Jr., there would be no defense, only a verdict waiting to be written. George had been in jail for 31 days when they brought him to trial. Not even a full month. Not even enough time for a proper investigation. This 14-year-old boy had no defense team, no experienced attorney to represent him. Just a volunteer, a man by the name of Charles Plowden, a local tax attorney who had never tried a capital case in his life. Plowden visited George only once before the trial. And do you want to know how long that he was with him? 10 minutes. 10. George did not even understand what was happening. He was 14. He thought that he would get to go home soon, back to his family, back to his mother, back to his father, back to his siblings. Instead, it was about to get much, much worse. April the 24th, 1944. They brought George in wearing ill-fitting clothes and shackles around his wrist and ankles. His eyes scanned the courtroom. Picture this with me. A hot, humid courtroom. May not have even had fans. An all-white audience, an all-white jury, a white judge, white prosecutors, and a packed gallery above on the balcony of more white people. Not one black person was allowed inside. Not one. His family, they were told, if you come here, you will be imprisoned. So they fled, they were threatened, and they were nowhere in sight. George Stinney Jr. was utterly alone. I can just picture George looking around for a friendly face, someone that would smile at him. There were none. Not one. The judge called the trial to order, and it began. The state presented absolutely no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no blood-stained clothes, no unaliving weapon. They had only the confession, an alleged verbal admission that George had made to the deputies without any witness, parent, or legal counsel present. The deputies claimed he told them that he had followed the girls into the woods. He had struck Mary Emma with a spike, and then Betty June when she tried to run. They claimed that this 5'1" boy dragged both bodies to the ditch and left them there. But George always maintained that it wasn't true, that he never said that. The night before his trial, he whispered to a guard, who later said, he whispered at me through the bars, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Shut up, boy. You're in a peck of trouble. He told him, they made me say it. I never said that. No one listened. Plowden, Georgia's court-appointed lawyer, called no witnesses. He did not cross-examine the sheriff. He didn't object to anything that the prosecution said. He didn't ask for a mistrial. There was no evidence. He didn't even try to appeal for this boy. He offered no forensic experts, which forensic experts in 1944. He offered no alternative suspects, no evidence of George's whereabouts. He stood. He made a closing short remark and sat back down, and that was it. The all-white jury left the courtroom around noon. They filed back into the courtroom 10 minutes later. No questions, no notes, no hesitation. Guilty, 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 guilty. 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 All 12 jurors, unanimous. You're guilty. The judge thanked them. Thank you all for being here present today. I am now going to pronounce sentencing on George Stinney Jr. to be unalived by electrocution. Now, I want you to keep this in mind. Again, a 14-year-old boy sentenced to be unalived by electrocution, found guilty in a town that wanted blood. That is all they wanted. Convicted in a courtroom that never let him speak one word in his defense. Not one. Amazingly, George's reaction shocked many. He didn't cry. Witnesses said later that he looked stunned, like someone who hadn't realized the nightmare was real until that moment. Prepare yourselves for this. One reporter claimed that George asked the bailiff, "What does electrocution mean?" They didn't answer him. There was no celebration. The town was quiet. There was no relief because the two girls were no longer among them. Only a date. June the 16th, 1944. Just 81 days after George's arrest. That's how long that he had to live. Children usually count down the days to birthdays, summer vacation, or holidays. George was counting down the days to the moment that his body would burn. He was sent back to his cell in Columbia, South Carolina. He had no toys, no books, just the ticking of a clock. Tick, 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 tick. And he had his Bible. There were some who whispered quietly because they did not want to call attention to themselves. A nurse at the jail later said she didn't believe that boy did it. It wasn't even possible. It just wasn't even possible. A white pastor, he begged for mercy for George. He's just a kid. He's 14 years old. Y'all are going to have the blood of that boy on your hands. And you're going to have to answer before God. Some of the local black community tried to raise their voices, but that was a mistake because they were threatened into silence. George's supporters, and he did have a few, were silenced before they ever had the chance to speak on his behalf. And those with power, they didn't care. Because it wasn't about justice. It was about control and vengeance and fear. A prison guard later admitted years down the road, this is hard to hear. That boy was so small. We didn't even know how we were going to strap him in the chair. He was so small. They had to build a booster seat for George. 14, 5'1", 90 pounds. The state was preparing to unalive a child. I can't even wrap my head around that. Can you? And they couldn't even figure out how to reach the switch. But no one stopped it because no one ever intended to. They had the guilty one. And that is all that mattered. George Stinney Jr. was convicted of murder after a one-day trial. Zero evidence on zero evidence by a jury that never saw him as a little boy. And he was only 14 years old. And I'm going to keep stating that throughout this because I just cannot believe what he went through. They only saw him as a symbol of hate. He was just 14 years old. And the clock kept ticking. Chapter 3. Death row doesn't wait for children. Some children play with matches, marbles, Others count the days until they're strapped to a chair. I did some research on electrocution, and it is possibly one of the most brutal methods to unalive someone. There are few places colder than unaliving room. But imagine entering it at just 14 years old. He was too small for his cot. He was too young to even shave, and too innocent to understand why adults around you wanted you unalived. This is where George Stinney Jr. waited. The iron door slammed shut behind him with a sound that would echo for the rest of his short life. Columbia Penitentiary. Unaliving row. It was a concrete tomb that was wrapped in barbed wire and a scent of hopelessness. This was no place for a child. But here George was. And let me remind you again, 14. 5 feet. 5 feet. Just a little bit over 90 pounds. But since he had been incarcerated, he was skin and bone. He didn't want food. George sat in his cell night after night, day after day, still believing that someone might come and save him. He was kept alone in a dark, narrow cell, too small for the cot. His legs dangled off the edge of the bed. The blanket was too coarse for comfort, the food too hard to swallow. There were no toys, no letters from home, no visits, no one to tuck him in, no one to pray with them at night, as his mom and dad used to do with all of the children before they retired for the evening. The silence was deafening, the fear constant. Can you imagine the fear that George felt? Sometimes he would hold the Bible, and God said later they would hear him reading from it. The 23rd Psalm. Sometimes he would sit in silence and he would clutch that book like a life raft. But most of the time, George just waited. In those weeks, no appeals were filed. No legal team stepped in. No higher court raised a hand and said, "Hold on a minute. Something isn't adding up here. Look at the size of this boy. No blood was found on him. How could he possibly unalive 2 girls and drag them into the forest, into a ditch?" No higher court raised their hand. Charles Plowden, his attorney, his defense attorney, had already moved on. The trial was done. The state was satisfied. And June the 16th, 1944 was the day. Just 81 days from the moment that he was taken off his porch, George Stinney Jr., 14 years old, was scheduled to be unalived. Years later, George's siblings would speak. They remembered everything. His sister Amy, who had been with him that day. When the girls spoke to them, she had begged her parents, "Let me testify for my brother. He didn't do it, Mama. He didn't do it, Daddy." She could have confirmed George's innocence. She could have did it. But she was never called, never allowed in the courtroom, silenced before she could even open her mouth. Decades later, Amy said through tears, I was there with him that day. I was with him. We talked to those girls together and then we left. That was it. But in 1944, do you think anyone cared what a little black girl had to say? George would ask his guards daily, has anyone written me? Will my mama visit? Can I see my daddy? The guards said nothing. Some of them would just shrug. Fat chance of that happening, boy. Sometimes they'd look away, but no one came. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. George's family had been forced to flee town. Threats had poured in like blood into a basin. Leave? Or you know what we'll do. Leave or be unalived. Choice is yours, ma'am. So they left, and George was left behind, a 14-year-old ghost, still breathing. Even as the date neared, George never admitted guilt. Not once. Even after the so-called confession, even after the conviction, even with his unaliving on the horizon, he would whisper to the guards, I didn't do it. Why don't they believe me? And there was never an answer because belief was never the goal. They didn't need the truth. They needed a sacrifice, a scapegoat, a symbol. June came fast. Each night the sunset lingered longer over the razor wire of the penitentiary. Each sunrise brought George closer to a chair that wasn't built for someone his size. They were building a booster seat for him to sit in. And with every tick of the clock, George Stinney Jr.'s hope just slipped further and further away. No last-minute clemency. No Supreme Court intervention. No appeals. Nothing. Just a date. And a chair. One of the guards noticed something odd. George's shoes that he was allowed to wear were hand-me-downs, and they were scuffed and torn. They did not match the solemnity of what was coming. So the guard did something very strange. He polished George's shoes the night before the execution, quietly, carefully, as if the ritual of the act could undo the horror of what was coming. but nothing could. Nothing could stop it. He was a child alone on unaliving row, counting days, not birthdays, reading scripture, not comic books, preparing to be unalived when he hadn't even learned how to live yet. Think about that. The state had locked him away to be forgotten. But the truth was still breathing. Chapter 4. The execution of George Stinney Jr. He was too small for the electric chair, but they did it anyway. Some dates mark history, others scar it. June the 16th, 1944 was the day that South Carolina silenced a child and called it justice. But no thunder cracked, no angels wept. The world simply turned while a boy with soft hands and a Bible was led to his unaliving. It was still dark when they came for him. George was laying on his cot. And amazingly, he felt at peace. I would like to think that there were some messengers in that room, in that small cell, comforting him. The morning of June the 16th, the prison corridors echoed with the quiet footsteps and keys jangling from a prison guard's belt. The silence was deafening. George hadn't slept. How could he? He was 14 years old, and the world had decided that he would be unalived before the sun even fully rose. The guards opened the cell and stared for a moment. Well, boy, it's time. He was just a kid, barely taller than the doorframe. His wrists were too thin for the handcuffs that they put on him. They led him down the hallway with his shiny, polished shoes. He clutched the Bible so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His shoes, now freshly polished, tapped softly against the floor. He didn't resist. He didn't cry. He just kept walking. Because what else could he do? The room was cold. The chair was massive. This chair had unalived grown men, murderers, criminals, rapists, but never a child. The prison officials stood in silence. Journalists, clergy, and guards filled the edges of the room. No family members were there for George. No loved ones. They pulled back a curtain and there were strangers just waiting to watch. They rolled out the chair, and George, he looked at it. His eyes widened. It was too big for him. Far too big. Even with the booster seat, it was still too big. He was so small that the prison guard grabbed his Bible and put it beneath him to make him sit taller in the booster seat. May I remind you just once more, 5 feet. 5 feet. Yes, the very book he clutched for comfort was ripped away from his hands and was used to raise his body higher. So the electrodes, if you don't know what electrocution is, so the electrodes could reach his head. His feet barely touched the floor. His arms trembled. The straps that were meant to hold down violent criminals hung loose around his thin wrist. A grown man would have fought, screamed, begged, but that little boy, George, he didn't. Because he still believed, somewhere deep down, that someone was going to come running down the hall and open up the door. Someone confessed. He's not guilty. Let him go back to his home. Let him go back to his family. We were all wrong. But that didn't happen. When asked if he had any last words, George's voice cracked through the stillness. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I didn't do it." He looked straight ahead and waited. Let me show you a picture again of George. "14. They placed the electrodes on his small head, strapped one to his leg. Then someone gave the nod. The switch was pulled. Electricity ripped through this 14-year-old boy's body. He jolted, twitched, smoked. The straps burned into his skin. but the mask that was covering his face, too large for him, slipped off mid-shock, revealing his wide, terrified eyes. The witnesses gasped. Some turned away. One journalist fainted. They were unaliving a child. And they knew it. But the current just kept flowing until George Stinney Jr. was still. At 8:38 a.m., George Stinney Jr., 14 years old, 5 feet, 90 pounds, was announced. Gone. The state marked it as justice, filed the paperwork, closed the book, and the world moved on. George was buried in an unmarked grave. No tombstone, no flowers, no name, just a number. Just a memory that no one dared to speak of. His family, who was still in hiding, they grieved quietly, haunted by the silence. But the earth remembered, and so did history. Years later, those who had witnessed the execution would describe it as one of the most horrifying things that they had ever saw. Not because of what George did, but because of what they did to him. A warden admitted he looked like a little boy going to school. Another said, Lord knows we didn't know how to strap him in. He was way small. No appeal, no mercy, no forgiveness, just a 14-year-old boy unalived. And a silence that would fester for decades. Let's take a 5-minute intermission, and then I will come back with the remaining portion of this story. Be back in 5. Hey, Awakened Buddha J. Hello, Ebony. Hey, Alabama. Hey, Cindy Minnie. I'm doing a 5-minute intermission. Yes, Lauren. That is a good idea. Absolutely. I'm so glad that you're back. Wamorphy, welcome back. Oh, I know. His family. I just cannot even begin to fathom. Hello, Lord Vader. Hey, Magic Moon. All right. Hey, Marine's daughter. Hey, Leslie Marie. Hey, X. All right. Let's get back into the story. Hello, Shell Renee, Psychic Medium, welcome. Chapter 5. Buried truths and forgotten graves. Some graves don't stay silent. They whisper, and they beg to be heard. After George was unalived, Alkulu grew quiet again. Too quiet. The townspeople returned to their routines. The guards put away the straps. The judge went back to his bench. But the earth knew what had been done. And beneath it, the body of a child lay waiting to be found again. George Stinney, if you are just coming in, was 14 years old. He was buried with no name, no stone, no eulogy. Just a shallow grave at Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery, surrounded by silence and shame. No flowers were laid on his casket, no mourners allowed. His body was bruised and burned and was lowered into the dirt like a bad secret. And for over 70 years, it stayed that way. The town tried to erase him. Alkulu moved on. Children weren't taught his story. Churches stayed quiet. And the same families that had shared his conviction continued to live, work, and worship, never once asking, did we unalive the wrong person? George's parents never recovered. His father never again held steady work. His mother aged overnight, her body collapsing under the weight of unspoken grief. His siblings grew up with the memory of a brother stolen, not just by a sister, but by neighbors who smiled at them just days before. They couldn't say his name in public. They couldn't even mention him. They couldn't grieve him without fear. They couldn't go to his burial site. And yet, they remembered everything. His laugh, his favorite game, the way he used to run beside the train tracks barefoot, and his mom would yell out, "Stop that, George! You're gonna end up cutting the bottom of your feet." That night they took it. The night the world ended for him. In Alkulu, the railroad tracks still divide the town. Still. White on one side, black on the other. The old mill stands as a ghost of industry. They've all mainly been changed into lofts. The fields remain. And the ditch where Betty June and Mary Emma were found, still there. Still haunted by questions that no one dared to ask. Who really unalived Betty June and Mary Emma? How could George have dragged two bodies that distance? And 90 pounds with no blood on him, no fingerprints, no sign of guilt. No one in power ever asked. Because the answer wasn't the point. Among black families in South Carolina, George's story never fully died. They still cried for him. It passed through whispered conversations after church. It lingered at the dinner table when justice came up as a conversation. It lived in the stories of elders who warned their children, "Don't you talk to white girls. Don't get too close." Remember what happened to that Stinney boy? George had become a symbol, not just of racism, but of what it means to be invisible. A ghost with no grave marker, a memory the state tried to burn. But the ashes never scattered. In the decades that followed, multiple legal scholars tried to examine George's case. They found almost nothing. Again, no written confession, no transcript of the trial, no physical evidence preserved, and almost all legal documentation had been lost or destroyed. It was as if the state tried to wipe the slate clean. They did not want to think about George Stinney Jr. anymore. As far as they were concerned, he was gone, case closed, it's over. But history doesn't forget that easily. And in the hearts of the wrong, silence becomes a weapon. George's body was buried, yes, but his story wasn't. It festered beneath the surface of the South. It waited. It whispered. It ached for someone to finally say what no one had dared in 1944. He was innocent. Chapter 6. The movement to reclaim his name. A whisper can become a storm, even if it takes 70 years. George's death was not forgotten, not by his family, not by the people who shared his skin, his fear, or his silence. For decades they spoke his name in hushed reverence. But the truth couldn't stay buried forever. Justice had felled him, but justice wasn't finished. For over half a century, George's story drifted like ashes in the wind, scattered across whispers, textbooks, and the few brave voices who absolutely refused to let him disappear. But real change, that takes time, and fury, and heartbreak, and truth. In the 1980s, George's siblings began quietly speaking out. They were older now, they were worn down, but they were alive. His sister, Amy, who had stood with him that day in 1944 and been silenced by fear, finally spoke. We were together when those girls asked about flowers, and then they left, and we never saw them again. But George didn't do it. I swear to you, he did not do it. On my mother's and father's grave, he did not do it. The Stinney family had lost everything: home, name, dignity. But they still had truth, and they were ready to fight for it. In 2004, a group of lawyers, civil rights advocates, and historians began digging. They read the few scraps of legal records that were left. They visited the site where the unalivings had happened. They interviewed surviving family members and townspeople, and they discovered what many suspected all along. No confession was ever written or signed by George Stinney. George's trial transcript was missing, I bet. His lawyer never filed one appeal. No forensic evidence tied him to the scene, period. And new forensic experts found the state's theory physically impossible. There is absolutely no way under the sun, one of the attorneys said, that George Stinney Jr. could have committed this crime. It had been 70 years. But in 2014, the Stinney family and their legal team began to officially file for a retrial, asking the courts to vacate George's conviction and clear his name. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about fame, it wasn't about revenge. It was about a child who had been strapped into a chair and murdered by the state, and whose innocence had never been given a voice. December the 16th, 2014, in that same state that had once sentenced George Stinney Jr. to be unalived, a courtroom now filled with his family, their supporters, civil rights activists, and attorneys determined to undo history. One by one, expert witnesses took the stand. They dismantled every part of the 1944 case. The confession coerced. The evidence non-existent. The trial a farce. The process a violation of constitutional rights. And most importantly, the boy, innocent. In a stunning decision, Judge Carmen Mullen made history. She wrote that George Stinney Jr.'s conviction had been a great injustice and ruled it vacated, officially clearing George Stinney Jr.'s name. Her ruling stated, "There is no doubt that Stinney's constitutional rights were violated in multiple ways. He was only 14 years old. No legal counsel or proper defense. His confession was likely coerced, and the speed of the trial and the execution was unconscionable." 70 years later, George Stinney Jr. was finally declared innocent. The chair was already used. The grave was already filled. No amount of justice could bring him back. But the truth could rise from the soil and speak. In the courtroom, George's siblings wept. People rose and clapped. The air shifted. For the first time in 70 years, the state of South Carolina had acknowledged that they were wrong. But for George's family, it wasn't a victory, it was a burial, a proper one. A boy that was finally laid to rest, not as a vicious, cold-blooded unaliver, but as a victim. It took 7 decades, but the truth found its way home. George's name, once buried beneath lies and silence, now stood in the light. Not guilty, not forgotten, not erased. Chapter 7, the girls, the ditch, and the other suspects. The truth wasn't buried with George. It was buried in plain sight. The court vacated George Stinney Jr.'s conviction, but one question lingered like a shadow in a pine-thick ditch. If George didn't unalive Betty June and marry Emma, then who the heck did? Let's go back to the beginning. Not with the boy who was blamed, but with the girls. They played the place that they were found, and the suspects no one wanted to talk about. March the 23rd, 1944, we're going back. Betty June Vinegar was age 11. and Mary Emma Thames was 7. They rode their bikes through the side of the white side of Alkulu and crossed into the black section of town, something that was considered rare and dangerous in 1944. They were searching for maypops. It's the fruit of a passion flower vine. They stopped to speak with George and his sister Amy near a fence. There were a few words. George and Amy told them where they thought they would be successful finding the flowers. And then they rode away. Betty June and Mary Emma rode away. Hours later, they were unalived. Their skulls were carved and caved in with a blunt object. They were found half buried in a ditch. One bicycle was on top of the bodies. They were bloodied and they were mangled. The town went cold with fear, but fear turned fast to vengeance. And Alkulu needed a name, and they chose George. But he wasn't the only one who should have been questioned. The ditch where the girls were found wasn't even near George's house. It was more than 500 yards away, across rough terrain, fields, and through thick vegetation. George weighed 90 pounds. The girls together, they weighed over 200 pounds. Experts would later testify, there is absolutely no feasible way that George could have carried or dragged both girls to that location alone without leaving obvious physical traces. Blood on his shirt, on his hands, on the grass, in the dirt. But the original investigators never raised this question because they never wanted an answer that didn't point at George. George was the, well, I would say man, but he wasn't a man. He was a boy. One theory that resurfaced in the 2000s focused on some white lumber mill workers who lived near the ditch. Men who had easy access to tools, secluded space, and influence. Multiple locals recalled a known predator in the white community whose name was never entered into official records. Men who frequented the area where the girls were last seen. One man in particular who moved away shortly after the unalivings and whose own niece claimed decades later that he had confessed to the crime. The sheriff's office never investigated any of them. They had their boy, they had George, and that was enough. Betty June Binniker's family, it's believed, had influence, connections to the town mill, local officials, and perhaps even the sheriff himself. Some have speculated that the true unaliver was protected to avoid scandal or shame, especially if he were connected to respected white families. George Stinney had no such protection, no power, no name, no chance. In 2005, an elderly woman came forward with a shocking claim that a deathbed confession had been made by a man who admitted to taking the lives of Betty June and Mary Emma after one of them saw something that she wasn't supposed to see. She said she told authorities about it, but her statement was never followed up on, never verified, never added to the record. It was as if the town had agreed, consciously or not, that asking the right questions would only unearth the wrong truths. One black elder from Akalu said, everybody in this town knew George didn't do it. But it didn't matter. It was never about the truth. It was about sending a message. And they did. Another said, there was a man. He was a white man. He used to watch girls play. He scared them. He left town right after George was convicted. No one asked him why. But the records show no mention of these men. Why? Because there's no record. Just whispers and graves and a boy too small for the chair. If justice had done its job in 1944, maybe the girls' real unalivers would have faced the chair instead. Maybe George would have been old enough. Maybe he would have been so old that he would have just floated away. Maybe the town would have healed. But the truth was buried right next to those girls and beside the silence that unalived George. Chapter 8, A Nation's Shame, A Boy's Legacy. He died in silence, but his name will rise louder than the thunder that once ignored him. The graveyard is quiet, but the echoes of what happened to George Stinney Jr., they still ripple through time. Injustice doesn't stay buried, especially when it wears the face of a child. George didn't live to see the change, but his unaliving helped to make the change. For decades, George's name was a name that was lost in footnotes, court files, and whispered prayers. But after 2014, after the vacated conviction, he became more than that. He became a symbol of the fragility of justice, of racial terror, of what happens when truth is sacrificed on the altar of convenience. After the court's ruling, George's story was told in documentaries, podcasts, high school classrooms, human rights panels, law schools, and civil rights forums. He wasn't just a name anymore. George Stinney Jr. had become a movement. And people began asking, how many other Georges were out there? I shuddered to think of that. Children accused, silenced, executed, forgotten. Across the country, students wrote essays about George. Activists carried signs with his face on them. Protesters screamed his name into microphones at Black Lives Matter rallies. Say his name, George Stinney. His face appeared in murals. His story was read aloud in courtrooms. His Bible, the one that was used as a booster in the chair, was placed in a civil rights museum as a symbol of both cruelty and hope. He became a saint of the wrongfully condemned, and his name, once spoken in shame, was now shouted in defiance. Despite the court's ruling, no one from the original case ever apologized. Not the sheriff's department, not the state, not the prosecutors, not the descendants of those who swore that he was guilty. They stayed quiet. Even as the world reeled from the truth, even as textbooks changed, even as children read about the boy too small for the chair. Legal scholars now use George's case to teach future lawyers how to not fail a client. He's featured in curriculum about juvenile justice and wrongful convictions, and the fight to end the death penalty for minors. Once a murky debate, it took on a new urgency with George's face behind it. The United Nations cited his story in reports on racial discrimination. Civil rights organizations made it a point of discussing it in their campaigns, all because of one boy who sat alone and died alone, so others wouldn't have to. George's surviving siblings, Amy and Charles, continue to speak. They never ask for money. They only ask for one thing. We only want you to let the world know that George Stinney Jr., my brother, was innocent. Say it loud, say it often, so no one can pretend that it didn't happen. George's story became the basis for stage plays, visual art installations, and novels. One short film, 83 Days, depicted the horror of his final days. Audiences wept. People stood silent after the credits, struggling to breathe under the weight of what they had just seen. Because it wasn't fiction, it was fact. And George's ghost still lingered in every reel of film. The electric chair that unalived George still stands in South Carolina. It's used as a historical artifact, a reminder. Some call it a monster. Some call it justice. But every time someone sees it, the question lingers: how did we allow a child to sit there? George Stinney Jr. was unalived in silence, but his story has become a siren, a warning, a war cry, a reminder that justice is not blind, it chooses not to look. And now the world looks back and it sees him. Chapter 9. Children like George, the ones we never knew. For every George that we remember, there are hundreds more lost to time. George Stinney Jr. was the youngest person ever executed in the United States in the 20th century. But night dwellers, he wasn't the only one. He became the face of injustice, but behind that face is a crowd of children, just like him, who were tried, convicted, and unalived before the world ever learned their names. This chapter is for them. George was 14 when he was unalived, but he wasn't alone in that fate. Before and after 1944, the United States had executed over 350 minors. Many of them poor, many of them black or brown, many without legal defense or family support of any kind. They were orphans, sharecroppers' sons, runaways, abused children, and boys who never stood a chance in a court system designed to devour them. Willie Francis, Louisiana, 1946, age 16. Convicted of murder after a coerced confession. The electric chair malfunctioned during his first execution. He screamed in agony, but he survived. The state trapped him back in the chair 1 year later. And this time, it worked. Thomas Granger, Massachusetts, 1642, age 16. Executed for immorality, the first juvenile execution in American colonial history. They unalived him in public, and children were required to watch. Joe Persons, Georgia, 1915, age 15. Convicted of an unaliving he swore that he didn't commit. No legal representation, no appeal, just a noose and a crowd. These boys didn't have Netflix specials. They didn't become symbols. They became dust. Between 1890 and 1950, states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina executed minors at alarming rates, often within months of their arrest. These children were rarely given due process. Most trials lasted less than a day. Some lasted only hours, just like George, and the outcomes were almost always the same. No witnesses for the defense, no appeals, no mercy, no chance. Of the minors executed in the Jim Crow South, over 75% were black. These were children that were criminalized for their skin and their poverty and their lack of power. Sometimes it wasn't even about guilt. Sometimes it was about just setting an example, reminding a community of their place. George's case wasn't the exception. It was the blueprint. Even after the death penalty for juveniles was ruled unconstitutional in 2005, Roper versus Simmons, the echoes remained. Kids still tried as adults. Kids given life without parole. Kids placed in solitary confinement. Kids targeted by a system that was built on fear, not rehabilitation. Some survive. Many do not. Their names never trend, their graves are unmarked, and their stories are unwritten. George's face now stands for more than just himself. It stands for boys whose mugshots became their tombstones. For the girls never believed. For the children buried twice, once in the ground and again in forgotten records. Every time we say his name, every time we say the name George, we are calling up all the others. We are refusing to let them vanish. Across the U.S., dozens of families are still fighting to have their sons and daughters' names cleared. Some never got trials. Some were lynched. Some disappeared in prison, just gone. And still their families speak, just like the Stinnies did. In backyards, in living rooms, in grave sites, in courtrooms, they speak now. Because truth doesn't have an expiration date. And justice, even delayed, still matters. George wasn't the only one. He was just the one that we finally heard. Behind his face is a wall of silent portraits, waiting for us to say, "We see you now, George." Some legacies are born in darkness, but they rise in fire. He was a child who died alone in a prison built for grown men. He sat on a Bible to meet the electric chair. But George Stinney Jr., the boy too small for the straps, he left something behind, something vast, a warning, a reckoning, a legacy that refuses to be silenced. George didn't have a defense team. He didn't have witnesses. He didn't have time. But what George Stinney did have, what he left behind, was a scar so deep on the American conscience, it still bleeds. That chair, massive, mechanical, cruel, was made to kill monsters, not children. The image of George seated on it haunts generations. A child that was barely 90 pounds. A Bible beneath him so the electrodes could reach. A face too young to shave. Eyes too young to understand. Even hardened men, prison guards and journalists call it the worst thing that they had ever witnessed. Some said the light in the execution chamber flickered. Others say that the air turned freezing cold. It wasn't justice, one reporter later said. It was a ritual. It was a sacrifice. He clutched it like a life raft that day, the very book that proclaims, "Thou shalt not unalive," was used to boost him up into death. Decades later, that same Bible, burnt to the edges from where it touched his body, was donated to his family, to a museum. It sits behind glass now, a symbol of belief, of pain, of twisted irony. Visitors stare at it in silence. Some cry, others tremble, because it's real and the weight of it is unbearable. After George's story re-entered the public eye in the 2000s, the ripple effect began. Multiple juvenile death penalty cases were revisited. Schools across the country added George's story to civil rights history curriculum. The chair was officially decommissioned for minors in all 50 states. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Roper versus Simmons 2005, which banned executions for crimes committed under age 18, was heavily influenced by cases like George Stinney. He became a cornerstone argument, a name cited in legal briefs, a face of the movement to protect children from the gallows. He was gone, but his story changed the law. Activists now say George stands as a kind of spiritual guard, a martyr for juvenile injustice. His face is painted on murals in schools. His name is etched into plaques and protest banners. His story is told in seminars, conferences, and rallies across the country. Say his name. He was 14. Never again. Amy Stinney, before her passing, said, "They tried to bury my brother in shame. Now he is buried in honor. We just want people to know that he was kind, he was smart, he liked to run, he had a good heart, and most importantly, he did not do it." George was not a symbol to them. He was their baby brother. And in every interview, they begged the same thing. Don't forget George. Why he still matters is because systems still fail children every day. Because courts still rush to judgment. Because the poor are still punished faster and harder. Because there are still kids sitting in jail cells right now who don't understand why. And because we need to remember what happens when we don't speak soon enough. George Stinney Jr., 14. He died in a chair not made for boys, but from his death came light. From his silence, a voice. And from that single worn Bible, a movement that still emerges today. He was too small for the chair, but he was big enough to change history. And that is the story of George Stinney Jr. And we are going to leave it like that tonight. If you have an emoji of a candle, can you post it right now for George? Thank you, Alabama. Let's all post a candle. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Magic. You're most welcome, Jester T. Jester was the one that told me about this story. Thank you, Jester. Absolutely, Annabella. Absolutely. Thank you all for remembering George Stinney Jr. That's absolutely right, Zena. That's exactly right. Hey, Dawn. Yes. Not tonight, Ms. Selma. This was an emotional, charged story. But I will be back tomorrow night, Thursday night, with Fiction Night. You're most welcome, Palm. Very much so, Leslie Marie. Hey, ask me LOL. That's all right, Judy. Just thinking of him. Stinny is spelled, I think it's S-T-I, let me see, S-T-I-N-N-E-Y. George Stinney Jr. Thank you, James. Selma, thank you for the follow. You're most welcome, Kimmy. Oh, shoot. That's right. I forgot what day it is. Tomorrow night is Paranormal Wednesday. Sorry. Why was I thinking it was Thursday? Oh, my goodness. Thank you, X. That's all right, Debbie Maple. Paranormal Wednesday. Yes. What was I thinking? I was like, tomorrow's Thursday. No, it's not. Sorry. This was a tough one. It really was. Most definitely. Well, it will be available on YouTube. Let me see. I'll be eating my hair right now. Yeah, I've got some here that are that I need to unlock. So I will go ahead and do that. And we'll make it public and save. Okay. Public. Okay, I already did that one, I think. Okay, I think I put them all public. So tomorrow night, that one should be ready if you want to go in and see it. Good night, Julie. Lauren, thank you for sharing the live. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, thank you. Hey, Sky. Let me look in YouTube here real quick. Hey, Truth Positive. Hey, Zoe Ann. Always good to see my night dwellers over there on YouTube. We hit over 300K tonight. Wow. You know, I've seen lives that are bigger than ours, and they don't have as many likes as we do. So that just goes to show how determined that we are to grow. Yes, so tomorrow night is Paranormal Wednesday. So sorry that I said that. Oh my goodness. But anyway, this has been a emotional story. Jester, once again, thank you for sharing it. And if you have a story that you want to hear, post it in the comments, and I will go ahead and start working on it. Oh, thank you, Diana Stewart. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Good night, Harper. Nighty night. Oh, thank you, Jester. Thank you. Good night, Karen. So good to have you all here. You're the sweetest, most wonderful night dwellers, and I just love you all to pieces. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end the live. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Diana. All right, loves. I am going to bow out now, and I will see you tomorrow night. Take care. Can someone please tell me what happened in the live tonight?